So, welcome. Yep, I'm delighted once again. I'm always delighted because I've always got great people with me. But today we've got Ian Wood, Alosa, and Emma. And guys, would you mind just introducing yourselves for those people that don't know you? And also welcome to everyone that's watching this. So yeah, could we kick off with you, Alosa, and just go around around the virtual room?
Yeah, so I'm Alosa. I'm Therapeutic Services Manager at Noah's Ark Centre, and I go into schools counselling in secondary and primary schools, mostly secondary right now. So yeah, a lot of work with children and young people over the past, and I love my job. I love that job. Yeah.
Oh, Alosa, how many people can say that? That's really good. And Ian, tell us about you.
Okay, my name's Ian Wood. I work for the Open Minds Partnership, which was formerly known as CAMS, the Child Adolescent Mental Health Services. And my role is that of School Links Coordinator. So I work really with education to ensure that schools have got the resources and skills that they need to be able to deal with the modern world. So I act really kind of as a person that they can come to for help. I also do advise on what to do with young people and how to signpost to services. But I sometimes will go into schools and directly observe young people only if it's necessary, and that's to help the school with their strategies.
Oh, excellent. Wow, that sounds like a rewarding job as well. And Emma, tell us about you.
Hi, I'm Emma. I work at the Noah's Ark as well. I am a psychotherapist. I work with children and young people and adults, but I specialise in working with children and young people on the autism spectrum.
Oh, so wealth of experience. It's always great to have everybody here and just sharing. So I'm Natalie. I'm the Young Person's Counselling Coordinator at Noah's Ark. And I work with children, but I also mostly work with adolescents. That's kind of my thing. And obviously supporting parents and supporting the counsellors as well. And I also love my job. So yeah, no, I thought today, because we've been talking about anxiety and over the last few weeks and just thinking about, you know, the idea of schools at some point going back, and obviously that is, yeah, full of anxiety, shall we say. But I thought today we would talk about panic attacks or panic disorder. And I thought we'd talk about it only because my motives are quite selfish, because I've actually got quite a few clients just over the years and current that really do suffer from this panic attacks. You know, they'll say to me, Natalie, I feel like I'm dying. I thought I was having a heart attack. You know, every description that you can imagine. And, you know, I just think, gosh, it really is such a reality in schools. And even when I go into schools, so many kids tell me that they're having these, so sometimes they're called anxiety attacks, sometimes they call it panic attacks. And that was actually one of my questions because I'd really love someone to clarify for me, what is the difference between this anxiety, panic attacks and anxiety attacks? Like, is it all physiological? What's going on in the brain? What is it? Could somebody please help me out and just clarify that for me, please?
If you want to try to talk about science is out there. And again, all the scientists will say we know very little about the brain.
Yes.
And it's surprising how little we do know about the brain. But what we do know is that panic is basically born out of the center of the brain. So you've got the amygdala, actually you've got two amygdala, one on each side. And they are responsible for looking out for danger in the environment. So our being is designed to keep us alive, safe and well. And the bit of the brain that's trying to do that is the amygdala, which is always alert for danger. If it perceives danger, and let's think about panic in terms of a life-threatening event, what that then does is it triggers this massive blast of adrenaline into the system. And again, it's really important that's there to keep us safe and well, because again, I always emphasize that's the story that we tell people when we're working with anxiety. It's our body's natural defense system. It's your body working well for you. So it fires this massive shot of adrenaline. The symptoms of a panic attack are pounding heart, difficulty breathing, your stomach's in knots, you're shaking, you're sweating. Some people feel that the throats are closing, weak, dizzy. All those really extreme physiological things happen as a result of that shot of adrenaline. The difference between an anxiety attack and a panic attack is subjective. It's very much down to the individual. So I imagine that those two phrases are interchangeable. What I could potentially understand from somebody or some of the people I work with when they're saying they're having an anxiety attack, what they may mean is that they've had a few bouts of anxious sensations where it's not full-blown panic and they're going into those symptoms I described, but they're getting that knots in the stomach, they're beginning to. The thing is, when you begin to worry, it starts to trigger the amygdala. So it can be cyclical. There's another part of the brain as well called the hippocampus, and that's the memory box of the brain. So the memory box of the brain will store those emotions, so it will remember things as well. The amygdala's job isn't just that emotional panic response. It has other emotional responses as well, such as pleasure, risk, all those things. And the hippocampus remembers. So when we talk about fear and worry, if we go through an experience that's where we're afraid of something, we'll remember that for next time. Or we might miss the dots. So there's all manner of things going on, but I think one more important thing about the science is the bit that regulates emotion is the prefrontal cortex, the bit right at the front here. And that's the rational part of the brain. But if we remember that our body is designed to be alive, safe and well, the amygdala will always be in control if there's danger present. So it will override every other system. So it will come as no surprise to somebody who's having a panic attack that whilst it's taking place, logic's out the window. So some of the techniques that we tend to give people when they're going through panic attacks probably aren't very useful because you're not connected. You can't suddenly think, right, I need to sit down, I need to collect my thoughts, I need to do my breathing exercises, I need to think happy thoughts, I need to count around my hand, all these things. Your cortex has got switched off. One of the models used to call it flipping your lid. So if you imagine this is your brain, that's the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala's in the middle of the thumb. And the prefrontal cortex switches off. So flipping the lid is a model we used to call it. And that's very much what's happening. It's a bit like anger. You're out of control. It's a red mist. It shuts down. Fight, flight, and freeze is the response that we get from being under situations of panic. So that's the best science that I've come across. There's some really good books out there. I'm not going to do an advertising campaign for anybody's books, but there's one in particular that explains very, very simply, which is, I think it's called Overcoming Anxiety and Panic by Dr. Harry Barry, which is, I think, is quite a memorable name. So you can also go online and he's got some YouTube clips on there as well, and he explains it quite well. So if anybody is interested in the research, that's one book that just off the top of my mind, I tend to go to a lot. Hope that explains.
Oh, thank you so much, Ian. No, that's absolutely brilliant. And isn't it amazing just how adaptive the brain is? It never ceases to amaze me. And that there's actually such a positive adaptive reason for why this happens. Now, the other thing sorry, my mind's just going so many thoughts as you're speaking, but I just thought, how long does it last? Because obviously when you're in it, it feels like forever. You feel like you're dying. You just want it to stop. Once it starts, you're in this physiological process. How long does it last? And what do you just ride it out? What would you sort of, how long does it last? How long is there sort of a time frame so that there's some hope that it's going to end at some point?
I'll answer what I believe from my perspective, and obviously I'll hand over to others. But yeah, that's really important, because if your prefrontal cortex is shut down and you're not being rational or logical, sometimes what people do is they tend to get hold of the person in the panic attack and crowd round them and sit down, put your head between your knees, breathe out, come on, let's get you out of this dangerous situation. And that can actually prolong the experience. So if you're kind of frantically trying to run and escape from an environment and you've got lots of people fussing around you, or you desperately want to flee from a building, evidence suggests that actually encourages it to take that little bit longer to wear off. There might be obviously circumstances where that isn't the case because everybody's different. But yeah, I think from my experiences is grounding is probably the best thing to do during panic. So it's feet square on the floor. There's a little mantra that Dr. Harry Barry talks about, which is say to yourself over and over again, or practice ahead of time, which is uncomfortable but never dangerous. Uncomfortable because what the person's experiencing is terror. They think they're going to die, but most often than not, there's no harm comes. And repeated experience over time doesn't always convince that person that that's the case. So if you ask anybody who has panic attacks regularly, people even end up in A&E. Do they ever die? No. Do they ever have anything dangerous happen to them? No. And it sounds like a very simple question, but when you ask people that, they go, well, actually, yeah, you're right. It never comes to that.
Yes.
I don't know why I convinced myself that that's the case. But yeah, grounding, keeping still, tends to make it go away quicker. But there are experiences where I've known people to overcome them in different ways.
Yes. Oh, that's so good. But that makes so much sense as well. I mean, so much of it is emotional reasoning. And if you feel like you're dying, then it's very real. And like you say, your frontal cortex, you're not going to ask yourself about the facts like, oh, yeah, did I die last time? You're just in it, aren't you? And it's so, from what clients have told me, it sounds awfully overwhelming and so physiological as well. I mean, I've had clients, I don't know about you guys, but I've had clients that have said to me, I woke up, I wasn't even anywhere, I was in my sleep, I was in my bed, and I woke up with my heart pounding, couldn't breathe, and I'm having a full-blown panic attack, and I'm thinking, you're in your bed, you know, and I think that's what's so fascinating, if in a morbid kind of way, you know, that there's not this, you know, somebody attacking me or coming, or there's triggers. It just literally can come on like that. Yeah. So what, I suppose that leads into my next question, like what are the underlying causes? What causes panic attacks? How do you get to that place where you're having a panic attack or you're having them often?
Can I pick up on what you were saying there, Natalie, about overwhelming? And I think there's something about it links in what you were saying, Ian, about the perception there, because everybody's feeling of being overwhelmed is different. It's subjective. There's but that is for each individual, that sense of being overwhelmed. And you might know that, not realize that a young person or someone you're working with has those feeling of, you know, in a family, you might not realize that they're feeling overwhelmed. But so I'm thinking with that panic, it's almost like a build-up of energy. So I often think of it quite a bit. You were mentioning, Ian, about anger. And that to me often does feel quite related with panic. It's like this built-up energy that has to be released somehow. So that I feel has a more of a link to, you know, that when it comes out and there's no trigger or it's almost just like a spilling out sort of energy that hasn't been able to be channeled in a different way. And it's almost, I mean, I often think when you think of panic, and maybe I'm thinking of it on a personal level as well, if I think of it at times when I might have felt overwhelmed, or is that uncontrollable crying, you know, when it's crying not necessarily because you're upset, but there's some sort of crying of helplessness, of overwhelmedness, of and a raciness of things can't kind of things aren't calm and still, and you know, so yeah, overwhelming and energy seems really quite key to me. And this, how is that energy going to be sort of channeled out? And I think in a relational way. So as a being trained in the relational approach to psychotherapy, we might think about people's relational patterns, and we think about often how we cope with things. It could be to do with moving against people in relationship with others. could be moving away, which is, I think, is a little bit more linked with the panic. The moving against can be the anger, and that often that energy that I've just been talking about can come out in that angry way if your relating pattern is to move against people, or you might be more moving towards, you try and please people, a people pleaser, and that can maybe be a little bit more in the panic sense. So that avoidance and pleasing others, because you actually you're containing a lot of your feelings. There's a containment going on, like an inability maybe to express and to, you know, we talk about extrovert, introvert, you know, these type of that type of analogy might work here as well. You know, can you get your feelings out? So you might, people who are angry, you can almost feel like they're in that panic energy, but those who have built it up and they haven't been able to let it out necessarily, maybe they're not allowed to tantrum. Maybe tantruming isn't how to get your needs met, or being angry isn't how to get your needs met in your system, you know, in their system. And so it builds up, but actually when the energy comes out in that way, maybe there is something about needs getting met in that way as well. So yeah, and it links up, I think, with Ian saying about the fight, flight or freeze, because I think in terms of how we develop from when we're young and in system with our family and the world around us, we tend to often cope with one of those type of approaches. Do we fight? Do we flight? Do we freeze? And often freeze is the hardest one to work with people, because you're not getting the feelings coming out there. You're not getting the kind of evidence of what's happening for them. But then it's got to go somewhere, and I think it's like the pan lid, isn't it? That the steam's got to go somewhere. It's got to get out somewhere. So the panic of waking up at night, that's it. It's coming out. It's going to spill out somewhere.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do you know, as you were saying that, Lois, I just thought that there's so much in that, because yes, obviously, if we were in nature, we'd be running or expelling that energy, but it's the uncoiling inside of us, isn't it? The sympathetic nervous system has just been triggered, and it just does this uncoiling thing, and we can't stop it. But when you said about certain, you know, like just about feelings, and you're not allowed to feel that, and you've got to suppress it all, I just thought, yeah, you know, with people with high pleaser drivers or be strong drivers, and certainly with the clients I've worked with, I don't know about you guys, but I've noticed certain traits of perfectionism, not wanting to let people down, and they take on a huge amount, of that burden of others as well. It's like they've got, it's like, I think of it as like a multi-plug, and just too many things plugged in and coming at them, and it's like an overwhelm of just too much, and then I don't know, I wonder about this.
I think the responsibility, like you say, Natalie, that some young people, if they've got responsibilities, and you know, people, every families are different, everything's a different, you know, and it can be across the board. It could be young carers, it could be people with a single parent family who they feel responsible for the well-being of that one parent who's looking after them, for instance. Young people with parents with mental health issues, you know, there's all sorts. So I imagine now, for example, in this current situation, you know, parents might be anxious about their jobs, might have lost their jobs. That's creating anxiety in them, and that responsibility, you know, in that relationship, young people do feel responsible for their parents, and that can create quite, and this isn't to make, it's kind of, it is what it is, really. It's not trying to make parents feel guilty about anything like that. It just is, that's, you know, that's part of being in relationship, that you do feel responsible, don't you, for the other to some extent. But sometimes it's about separating what is their responsibility and what isn't. And I guess sometimes it can be hard in cases where there's young people who are responsible, like young carers, to look after their siblings and their possibly their parents, or because it may be all they've ever known from quite a long time, that this is what they did, look after their younger siblings. but actually over time, so to them it feels like, well, this is my norm. How can that feel like a pressure? But actually, when they look at it, sometimes it's like, actually, it's the hidden pressure. It's the pressure that they've come to, that's come to be their normal, that in the end finds its way out as this panic, because it's not a responsibility that they can easily get away from and just hand over to somebody else, or find, it's there. So the pressure is there all the time. Responsibility is there.
Yeah. Oh, and so it can be very environmental as well. If you, and it's in, as well as everything else. I'm just wondering for you, Emma, you work with families and obviously with the ASD kids, and how does this fit into your client group, and what is your experience? What have you sort of observed with panic attacks?
I think it's really interesting, I think, with my client group. I think there's different, obviously the spectrum's so wide that everybody's totally different, obviously. And some people will experience a panic attack similar to others, some people totally different. I think quite typically with ASD, there's quite a high level of anxiety inbuilt in that person, or in that young person, that they get used to eventually, I think, and that it's a struggle. It's a much more prolonged thing for them often, I think, because they're so high anxiety wise, that panic, it sort of builds and builds and builds, but they're in it for a much longer time. And I think often it's more an emotional dysregulation that sort of comes out, that, like you were saying earlier about it's not acceptable to tantrum, it's not acceptable to expel that energy. Well, for them, they can't necessarily avoid that, and it comes out rather than holding that within them. It often comes out, and often like in a meltdown, which I don't particularly love that label, but no. I tend to go with whatever the young person wants to call it. But it comes out in that way, really, and it's very linked, I think, with anger. In a lot of my young people that I work with, it comes out as anger, and it looks like anger, and it's perceived as anger, but actually it's anxiety often, and it's panic. But it comes out, it just presents itself in different ways, I think, and it's sometimes quite more organic, really, I think, with the people I work with, because they just show exactly what's going on for them, and it does come out and it is expelled. And I think it's seen as a bad thing, which I know it can be a bad thing sometimes, and they can hurt themselves and they can hurt other people, and that's when we need to sort of try and contain it and try and get them to regulate a little bit. But actually sometimes it's necessary to get some of that out. And often a lot of the people I work with, they sort of stim, and they'll flap, and they'll make noises, and they'll click, and they'll jump up and down, they'll do all sorts, and they regulate their energy really well, actually. They do things that are inbuilt that sort of stops them getting to that panic phase. And I think really good how they do it, really. For people who are seen as not being able to regulate themselves, they regulate themselves amazingly well, actually. They do really well with it.
That's so interesting and so ironic as well. And actually, they model it really well, that maybe we do need to just, ride that wave and shake and expel the energies. Thank you, Em. That's so fascinating. Yeah. Gosh, so much to think about. So, the other thing sorry, I'm full of questions. Forgive me, my brain's just like, oh golly. But the other thing I was wondering, because I've been thinking about this before we came on, obviously, and I was thinking about, some of the teenagers I work with as well, and I don't know if you guys can relate, but so much of them will say they'll have panic, they'll say, oh, I have panic attacks or anxiety attacks, but then they'll have it's very much become such a fear of embarrassing themselves, so then they would rather avoid going anywhere where their peers are, or they really worry about, but what if it happens in class? you know, what if I faint and fall down and my skirt of my head? What if, you know, all of these terrible, awful fantasies that what if negative, awfulizing, catastrophizing scenarios really gets linked with this panic and feeling out of control. And I guess my question is, I just wondered when it sort of crosses over to becoming a real disorder, you know, and where you think, oh gosh, yeah, this is panic disorder rather than a panic attack, or you know, one-off panic attack or a one-off anxiety attack, or feeling anxious. It just, yeah. Maybe you could answer that, Ian.
Sorry, you just last bit again.
Was I breaking up?
No, sorry, I'm just thinking sort of, there's two things there. I mean, going back to why people have anxiety, you know, we are very complex biological organisms, and if we knew the answer to that fully, I think we'd probably be better at dealing with it. One of the things I often say to a lot of my colleagues is, if you look at the stories that the young people tell us who are experiencing these things, is it any surprise they're feeling anxious? Because a lot of our young people who come to us where enough's enough and they need that professional support, their life stories are usually quite traumatic. And anxiety, when it gets to sort of more around panic, it tends to be sort of more deep-rooted in those kind of trauma-related, or chaos in the family system, or adverse life events and things. So yeah, it's usually something quite, you know, obvious. And I always say, if I had lived through that, would I be anxious too? And the answer would be certainly yes. There are other things around, things like attachment theory, which, you know, we haven't got time to explore at all, because that's a whole different subject. But yeah, if you think about that brain development, the first few months of a baby's life, it's all born through this developing brain, and the amygdala again, and these kind of emotional centers are working in overdrive, picking up everything from around them. So if a young baby's kind of brought up into the world around a lot of chaos and disorder, then that part of the brain is going to be heightened anyway, and that kind of stays with that young person. And like I say, the amygdala is there; it overrides everything when it's triggered. So if that brain's been sort of born into the world where that's working overdrive and are more alert, then they're going to experience more signs and symptoms of that. We can get onto what we can do about anxiety later, but yeah, one of the reassuring things about that is the brain is very changeable. So just even though it's developing, it can be changed to have more positive results. So I suppose that then leads me on to that teenagery thing. We've discussed this before, but the brain is still developing through adolescence. So those parts of the brain that we've already talked about are still developing and still shaping the forming. So if we look at a typical teenager in terms of the things that we describe, and sometimes we're quite cynical and detrimental about, it's that idea that, you know, there's risk-taking, there's moodiness, there's embarrassment, there's all these things taking place as well as, and then throw something into the mix which is quite traumatic for that young person, whatever it might be, then that's going to ramp everything up even more. So it's one of the sort of main things I come across is that a young person will feel perhaps that are being evaluated by their peers around teenage times. So they might say it's bullying, which it could well be, because we know that that does exist, unfortunately. But kids are more tuned in, they're very sensitive. So it might just be look, a glance, and that's that person doesn't like me. And then the other thing about worry that we haven't really touched on is again, it's the idea of when does a worry become something more significant? And a lot of these worries turn into what we call catastrophizing. It's oh no, it's the end of the world kind of stuff, you know. Everybody hates me, the world's against me, I'm a bad person, my teachers think I'm rubbish. So again, you get all that kind of stuff going on that's not true, but the young person believes it to be true. Talk about beliefs again. So, yeah, it's a perfect storm really when a teenager starts to experience anxieties on top of normalized fears. So yeah, it's almost a case of being realistic. Is what that person going through, is it very real to them? And is it any wonder they're feeling that? One of the things that we always work with in terms of helping anxiety is the idea of that perception. what is that? What does that person believe is going on? What's the reality of the situation? And quite often it's a very distorted reality as well. But yeah, again, I can't emphasize enough, the person that's going through it believes and fully thinks that that stuff is real and it affects them. So we could never patronize anybody, no matter how daft it seems or how illogical it seems. That's quite often, being a parent myself, sometimes we get confused. It's, that's daft. You don't need to tell yourself that thing. Yeah, don't be so stupid. Or you've got everything going for you, but the person doesn't believe that. A friend of mine used to say, if what you see in the mirror you're not happy with, no matter what somebody's going to tell you look like, you're still going to believe what you see. So your reality is what you believe. It's true. So yeah, beliefs shape reality. If you believe that you are no good and worthless, then somebody saying you're not doesn't match with your model of the world. So it's often a good place to start with that young person, really acknowledge that what they're going through to them is true. So yeah, I understand that you feel this way. I can imagine that what you've been through has been horrendous. I really hope that working together, one of the things we can do is try and change the way that you feel, because that's a positive outcome. But I believe you, you're experiencing that. That's really
Oh, that's so good. And I thought what you said about validating is so important, isn't it? Because I mean, the best will in the world, some parents and possibly people that are around when they're having these panic attacks or whatever they call it, they won't necessarily understand. They might be like, well, just calm down, just relax. What you making such a fuss about? And of course, that's just so invalidating, because what they're feeling is so very, very dire and real and awful. And so much of it is their heart racing, like you were saying, and they're feeling nauseous and I'm going to faint. And it's, for them, it is so, so very real, isn't it?
Can I just say then, I think the fact Ian's brought up that trauma-related, what these kids, if you actually knew what a lot of these kids have gone through, and whether it be domestic violence, whether it be sexual abuse, whether it be, the traumas that are quite heightened there. You often get relational traumas of the subtle ones, which schools will be very aware of, because they can never quite pinpoint it. You can't refer, the emotional kind of abuse that's those relational kind of traumas that you get as well. But I think, we are privileged at times to hear in confidence young people telling us what their life's been, or us being able to get into that world of where they've been, and we do, the amount of times when you said in, you think, well, I would be anxious if, you look and you think, yeah, this is the course of events. And I think sometimes explaining that to young people, being able to reflect that back and say, well, actually, you've explained this about your history. It's no wonder that you feel like this is normal, that you would feel anxious, or you would get triggered by that teacher that shouts at you, and that would send you into a panic. Those things that are all linked together often towards their past. And I think there are so many kids out there, and I don't mean to say that we will get to the hopeful place, we've still got time, but there are so many kids out there who are suffering PTSD, and we say it like, you always think about PTSD as something that people in the war come back from wars and face, or or they might have parents who are suffering with that from domestic issues, and that is something that triggers all that kind of response, the fight, flight and freeze responses that are all that science, we're talking about, that are very inbuilt. So I think those things are quite hidden, aren't they? We don't know. We just look at it and we say anxiety, panic, but what's rooting that can be all sorts.
Yeah. Oh, so what you said there, I think, is so relevant, because if you're living in a world that's out of control, and then you're starting to feel internally, physiology wise, out of control, that must be so overwhelming. I can't even imagine. And of course, you know, there is something about then, if you've had this awful experience, I guess there's something about becoming a bit hypervigilant to your body sensations as well, you know. I mean, I suppose that brings me on to what helps as well, because I was thinking, you know, in the early days when I when I was a bit green like a cabbage and I started working with worry and stress, I always used to say, oh, but just breathe, you know, everything will be fine. And of course, so much of the breath is involved with panic, isn't it? The hyperventilating, the shallow breathing, and all of that. And I was just thinking, guys, I mean, I know some people recommend don't do the relaxation, just move towards the panic and embrace it and prove to yourself that it's not going to kill you, you're going to be fine. And then, of course, other people do recommend some of those lovely relaxation techniques. And I was just wondering what your thoughts were around sort of what might help, and certainly also what other people should do when they're around people having these awful experiences of panic. You know, what is helpful?
Well,
Go for it.
I can just say briefly, really. I mean, I think, I mean, maybe I'm a bit naive in that respect, but sometimes I think I would advocate something about attending to the breathing, whether, you know, say just breathe, because I think sometimes they can almost forget to breathe. It's like, I'm thinking of that exam sort of panic where you might sit in a room and they might sit in the room and then start to feel the panic, but actually if before the panic's allowed to build up too much, they can take some deep breaths and allow because there's also evidence that shows by taking those deep breaths, it switches that prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking, back on, so they can then begin to start trying to think a little bit more about strategy, you know, strategies they might have known or learned or whatever. So yeah, something that, trying to find techniques that switch that front part back on, switch the rational thinking part back into gear quicker. So, and it might be things that can ground them, things that make them feel that they can hold. I know a lot of my young people, they'll have something in their pocket that actually they can hold, and it makes them feel more grounded back in the here and now. It brings them back into reality almost.
Yes.
Even simple things, and some young people, not recommended by me as such, but have said they have things like Play-Doh in their blazer pocket that they can just, or a stress ball or something that they can just squish to get. And some of that, I think, goes back to that energy thing, doesn't it? Something that really is able to release a little bit of energy, maybe.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think you're absolutely right, Lois. There's something about just having in the present while you're in it, just to remind yourself that you're going to come out of it, that this is just your body actually doing a very adaptive, normal, helpful response, and that it's not going to last forever, because you just need that reassurance when you're going through it. And it doesn't help when people are going, just breathe, just relax. You know, when your body's doing its own thing and you're out of control and it's happening and there's nothing you can do to stop it, I always say, don't try and stop it. Just ride the wave. We're talking about riding the wave, don't we? But I think there's something about, like you say, comforting, to just remind yourself it's going to end. Like, it's not going to last forever, and your body's just going to have, you know, it's going to ride it out. And I think the more you try to fight it sometimes, the more panic you can get. Yeah, sorry guys. Ian, what were some of your thoughts around that? I'm very curious to know.
I think it's, well, I think it should be quite reassuring for people out there. And again, we're talking very much around panic attacks specifically. There's a lot of help, and a lot of help that's very successful. And I think it's a kind of multifaceted approach, really. So it should be around lifestyle changes, mindfulness exercises, cognitive behavioural therapy is the go-to therapy of the moment. It's on trend. It's very good therapy, very evidence-based. There are other therapies out there as well as. And I think those are the things that we need to address. So yes, as panic's taking place in the moment, that's one thing. But it's when it's not, so we're talking about being transient, that's where you can do all this really good work. So lifestyle choices might be, let's have a look at a bit of exercise. What are you doing physically? Because exercise is beneficial for everybody and everything. all the evidence that people are coming up with now in the scientific world is actually exercise outweighs any medical intervention, any therapeutic intervention. Getting outdoors is really good for us. We look at nutrition, stuff that we're eating, again, around anxiety. Again, I'm not going to focus on energy drinks so much, but we can put substances into our body that really do produce stimulating effects on our respiratory system, our central nervous system. So young people might go to school on an energy drink or some kind of sugary snack. We know that that makes our heart beat faster, which can give us the effects of anxiety. So really good nutrition. So looking at that, and sleep is another thing, having a really good night's sleep. And what do we do before we go to sleep? What are we doing to wind down, to relax? We haven't touched on mindfulness, again, very trendy at the moment, but it's just this idea that there are things out there that we can all do and practice that will help us self-regulate, because we're not taught that stuff. Well, we are being taught that stuff in schools now because people like us are going out there and doing it. But it wasn't taught when I was at school. And so just learning some very basic techniques to allow ourselves to self-regulate. The other one as well that we've got to sort of touch on, but maybe stay clear of as well, is challenging technology. Young people have gadgets glued to them left, right and centre, and they will take them into the bedroom at night. They will carry them around all day. Their world is out there for everybody to see at all times. So again, if you think about what worry and anxiety is and panic, if you think about there's something niggling away, I best go and check. I'll check again. I'll just keep checking. It used to be that I worked with people who were feeling anxiety, that they would have to post something on a social media site and then see how many likes they were getting, and if they weren't getting any, it'd be making them more anxious. So they were just constantly checking and getting more wound up. So challenging technology specifically with kids, I know it's tough for parents to do that, but it is really crucial that we do address that at some point. But yeah, I think there's lots of stuff out there that can help and is successful, to the point now where people with panic and anxiety attacks are going to get the help, and very quickly they're walking out of those services feeling much better and not experiencing them anymore. So there's not really a magic wand as such, but there are things out there that that young person can take with them, because it's up to them, that they can be shown to do, which helps.
So good. Thank you, guys. Oh, and Emma, can you share a little bit with us? What do you kind of tend to, what's your go-to kind of?
I often think of it as sort of three sections, like the foresight, the hindsight, and the in the moment. And often the in the moment is where you can do the least work, because like your lid's flipped and you can't do anything about it. And for that, I use sort of the hindsight and the foresight to put the plan together, to be able to communicate that to teachers, to friends, to parents, that what that child or young person needs in that moment is to be kept safe, because often with my client group, they can be banging their head off things, they can be hitting out, they can be scratching at themselves, pulling their hair, they can hurt themselves or other people, like their peers, their siblings, often their siblings, to be removed and put into a safe space where they can and be left to cool down, be let to expel that and be let to cool down. So often the work with me is, they've always got hindsight, because that's why they've come, because it's happening. So I tend to work in that period often, because I think with my young people, they often find the hindsight overwhelming a little bit, because they take it as, well, now I know this, I've got to do that in that moment. So looking at it from hindsight, I sort of try and get them to think about what they need from other people in that moment, what they can do themselves in that moment. So giving them some empowerment, giving them some power in there, so that they can think, well, what can I do about this as well? How can, building up to that, what can I do before I get to that level, that I can expel some of this energy before, or how can I communicate this to others? Because I think that's a big part of the issue for my young people, that they're not able to communicate why they're panicking and why they're in that state at the time, and they often don't know, but building up to it, they do know. And it's working out when's that point to communicate this. And I often do a lot of work as to where they feel it, where they find it in their body, and working out triggers and trying to identify it sooner rather than later so that they can put some of these things in place. And often they draw everything out themselves, and we make all this up as a plan. And then I do encourage them to show it to parents or to teachers often, so that it helps with the communication. They don't have to go up to them and say and reel all this off and try and communicate that verbally. They can use this as a visual for others. Just as it's helped them, it can help their families as well.
Oh, that is so rich and so good, Emma. I love the fact that they sort of in control of that as well, drawing up their plan and giving them some control back as well. It's so good. So yeah, and I guess there's something about also, if you're in school and it happens in school, like, what would you recommend staff do, or what's the most helpful thing? I mean, I just think it's to just reassure the person that it's gonna that it's gonna, you know, and be with them in it, but not necessarily trying to shut it down. But I guess in school it can be quite tricky, you know, when you've got a classroom full of students and someone's having that must be
it's really difficult, I think, in school, and it's really difficult for the young person because, like we said earlier, they've got that social aspect of it and they're embarrassed, and often my young people can mask it quite well at school actually, and they'll which is what makes it happen when they get home, because they've held it in and held it in and held it in all day, because they are able to, they'll hold it so that they're not embarrassed and so that they're not doing it in front of people, and then it comes out later. But often that doesn't happen as well, and it does come out at school. And I think it's really difficult for teachers because, like you say, there's a class full of people. I think it's always about the safety of everybody first, but at the same time, it's, I don't know, not making a massive spectacle of it, not making a big scene of it, and just being understanding, I suppose, that this is a real thing that this young person is going through, and they're not doing this on purpose. They're not doing this because they want to. They really, really don't want to. This is the last thing they want to be happening.
Oh my goodness.
Understanding, isn't it, about it?
Yeah, I mean, who would choose to feel like that? Who would choose to feel those awful sensations? It's horrible, isn't it? It feels like you're dying. I mean, so many people said to me, it feels like the walls are closing in and it feels like I'm dying. And I can't help thinking a lot of it's sometimes linked with this agoraphobia and other phobias as well, like, and also so much avoiding, of course.
I think young people in school can often be, they're always a little bit confused whether to ask for the timeout card, because schools generally have things like timeout, so that, you know, before if they can sense that bit before they're maybe going to be going into panic, they can leave. They've got a timeout card if they're having panic attacks regularly in school. But then at the same time, having that timeout stands them out from the rest of the class, so they feel like, well, I'm not sure I really want that card as such yet, because it's everybody then says, oh, you're leaving. You know, if people don't completely realize what's going on and wondering, they start asking them questions, then why are you always leaving this class, you know? So some of the things that can be done to try and help are really helpful for some, and then for others can exacerbate the situation potentially. So when you're saying, Nasty, about what should schools, I think what should schools do, I think there's just that keeping that listening ear and asking the young person what is helpful for them. Like you were saying, Emma, you ask your young people, you know, how would you like others to respond? What, you know, what would be what would make you feel safer in that setting? Do you want people to come and help you, and come and maybe a friend come with you, or for the teacher, what would you want the teacher to do in the class with you? If that's been recognised as an issue for a young person and they're at that point where they can talk about it, having that bit of a plan. And it probably comes back, you were mentioning in our other talk, you know, being responsive rather than reactive. So responding when that initial young person is beginning to show signs of having those panic attacks, as to, well, what's the best, that collaborative approach with them, what's the best way forward, because it will be different, won't it, for different young people?
Absolutely. Oh, that is so good. And I love that the idea of being responsive and not reactive, and asking them what's the best way to what would be most helpful. That's so good to give the control back. Any thoughts before we go, guys? I'm just aware of the time, and again, it's just flowing. It always does when we chat like this. But yeah, any thoughts before we go?
I think it's just from what Alosa said there that she hit the nail on the head. It's about these ideas of allowances. Again, one of the things I would always say, if there's parents watching, young people watching this, is if you are experiencing anxiety to the point where you're having panic attacks, then please get the help. Schools know how to do that, or they should know how to do that. But again, this sounds a little bit patronising, and again, I've got a great degree of faith in schools because they are above and beyond with everything that they do. They're no longer just educators. But sometimes it's those allowances because, again, the whole thing about mental health stigma is it's an unseen thing. So just as somebody with an allergy would have an exception in the school and there'd be all manner of policies and procedures in place for that, or if somebody had some kind of physical injury, you wouldn't expect them to be able to access certain parts of the building. Broken leg, can't walk upstairs. So if somebody is experiencing panic, it's making those same kind of allowances. So also with the timeout cards, with additional support, providing that that's not causing more anxiety. There's a case of a school that I worked in where somebody had a panic attack, and the frenzy around that contributed crucially to the panic. So there was a big crowd of people around. Teachers didn't know what to do. They were all very worried because somebody looked like they were dying on the floor. Then the ambulance was called, so blue flashing lights. So there was all that attention. That's not going to make life easier. So again, it's about having training, and it's putting policies and procedures into place. And schools across Calderdale, all schools that I've worked in alongside yourselves, have had that training now. There's probably more we can do to support schools, but it's very much about, again, what can we do ahead of time to make sure that if this happens, we know what to do. And schools are really responsive now.
I take my hat off to schools. So I do think, like you say, Ian, they've got such a broad role these days, haven't they? And it's more challenging than ever, with high anxiety, and it's so present, isn't it? Guys, thank you so much. You've all had amazing things to say, and I'm just like, I'll probably end up with more questions now than I have answers, because you just stimulate my brain so much. And thank you again for hanging out with me, and just for being so gracious with your time. So thankful, and we'll see you next week. Take care, guys. Bye.
Didn't have much respect for